Greetings once again. This is my one-take video for The Hours. First, a mise-en-scène quiz. You will, of course, remember that mise-en-scène means the details in the shot. It's a formal film term. So, here's the quiz. Okay. Who is that? Maybe a little better view. You're right. That's William Shakespeare. You probably don't know who this is. These are 4 images from the Book of Urizen by the poet William Blake. Someone I wrote part of my dissertation on. Another person I dissertated on, this is William Godwin, who was an anarchist philosopher. Anyway, just thought I should point out, I think you've been seeing those in every video, and you're probably wondering, who are those people? What are those images? So, just continuing your education in film. On that subject, I have a soundtrack today, another formal film element that inflects the meaning of film, and that's sound design. My soundtrack, I don't know if you can recognize it. It's the soundtrack of The Hours, which was composed by Philip Glass, a famous minimalist American composer, born in Baltimore. I've just learned. He's also done the soundtracks for dozens of films, and is usually does 2 or 3. In fact, the latest reboot of the Fantastic Four will have a soundtrack by Philip Glass. He was nominated for an Academy Award for his soundtrack for The Hours, also for Kundun, which is a Scorsese film about the Dalai Lama, which I recommend. Anyway, I may have to turn the music down. I'm hoping you're getting some of that. But I, for one, think the soundtrack of The Hours is an integral part of the film, particularly the theme of repetition and what have you. In fact, that's my little Philip Glass joke. So you might only get it if you're into minimalist music. But you could talk about any piece of classical music that Glass has written, and the first part goes like this: da 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 da. The second part goes like this: da 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 da. Anyway, my little minimalist joke, provoking minimal laughter. Okay, another thing, I am going to talk about The Hours and about books, since that's a big part of the film. I'm actually going to start with a book that doesn't have much to do with it, but it does have to do with adaptation. And I'm not talking about the next film we're going to be seeing on the syllabus. The book I'm talking about is The Polish Officer by Alan Furst. Alan Furst is he's an American author. He writes about historical espionage, generally World War II, build up to World War II, similar to Foyle's War that I talked about in the last one. Anyway, he's a wonderful writer. I mean, he doesn't just craft a good spy story. He's actually has a very wonderful style that I very much recommend. However, I started reading this recently because I thought I had seen the adaptation of it on television. It's actually a BBC series, and it was about a Polish officer and other things. Well, let me just say that I read I saw the film before I read the book. So I have been reading this book, The Polish Officer, starring the star of the television show that I saw, which was called The Spies of Warsaw. So you may think The Polish Officer and Spies of Warsaw, that's 2 very different titles. I admit I was confused. So I had seen the adaptation of The Spies of Warsaw while I've been reading The Polish Officer. I've been seeing the actors from The Spies of Warsaw in a Polish officer. And part of my confusion is that the opening scene of the book, Polish Officer, is secret agents getting the gold supply out of Poland at the beginning of World War II after the Nazis have invaded. And it just so happens that Spies of Warsaw, the television show series that I saw, ended with getting the gold out of Warsaw. So I was thinking, this isn't a very good adaptation, or actually it made me think about how you structure stories on film as opposed to in a book. So my thinking was that you could, in a book you could begin with that, but in a film that's just your natural end point of the story. That's the climax. So I thought they switched it around so it would fit better within a film formula. But as I said, I was wrong. But the star of The Spies of Warsaw is a Brit, David Tennant, and I don't know if you've a couple iterations ago he was Doctor Who, and he's terrific in Broadchurch. If you haven't seen that, that's just an amazing series. I haven't seen the second series yet, the second year of Broadchurch. But David Tennant, he was Captain Demuse or whatever his name is in this one. But as I said, he actually was playing a different character in a different book. But nonetheless, David Tennant is starring in Polish Officer in my brain. So I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but it's important in terms of reading a book and then seeing a film adaptation, as opposed to seeing a film adaptation and then reading the book. And it's the same thing with The Hours here. I guess it's good jumping on point here. This is my copy of The Hours. Michael Cunningham's The Hours. So this is a film tie-in version. It has the three main actresses on the cover. So again, in fact, I'm thinking about it now, that I read the book and then I saw the film. But I think when I read the book again, I see these actresses in the roles. Definitely Julianne Moore in the role of Laura Brown. So isn't it interesting? I'm not just babbling here. The idea that when if you see a film or a television series and then read the book, that your imagination casts the film or TV characters in those roles. All right, but I am talking about the Hours here. And I also mentioned, this was also an issue when I mentioned Wolf Hall, is that the Polish Officer, the other one, the Polish Officer and Spies of Warsaw are part of a series of books about the role of Poland in espionage activities in World War II. So it's an issue when you try to adapt a whole series as opposed to just a single work. All right, we're 8 minutes in. Okay, so the other books I'm going to talk about relate to The Hours. The Hours. And the first one is Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. You may recall that in The Hours, Virginia Woolf is writing Mrs. Dalloway. And there was actually a decent film adaptation of Mrs. Dalloway about 10-15 years ago with Vanessa Redgrave in it. I thought it was decent. I don't think it got very good reviews. So, but as I mentioned in my film essay, Michael Cunningham's The Hours is in a sense an adaptation of Mrs. Dalloway, as it is also sort of a meta narrative about the making of Mrs. Dalloway. But a very important stream of consciousness work in English. The two figures in stream of consciousness in English are James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. Those are the two pioneers in that particular form. So an important book in its own right, and not just because it inspired Michael Cunningham's version of Mrs. Dalloway in The Hours. Now, The other book I want to talk about here is Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is a work she wrote, I think, just shortly after she wrote Mrs. Dalloway. So it's also a stream of consciousness. It's also a very important work in that particular mode of writing. And I have a personal story attached to it. Don't have too many personal stories about books, but this is one of them. When I was in college, in undergrad, we were assigned to read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. So it was quite a while ago. So back then, it wasn't uncommon for teachers to assign an entire novel. Put an entire novel on a syllabus, and now tend to break them up or break them down or have very short novels or what have you. So, I mean, To the Lighthouse is a fairly short novel, but it's quite difficult being stream of consciousness. Now, my personal story, continuing, is that, again, it was assigned to me, and like many of you, no doubt, I didn't have, I had a full schedule, and I could not read that novel until I absolutely had to read that novel, which was the weekend before I was going to be tested on it. So I finally sat down, and I spent most of the weekend reading the book To the Lighthouse, and it had a profound experience on me. The fact that I because of my scheduling, whatever, I forced myself into the novel, and I was, eating, drinking, sleeping the novel. I was completely immersed in it, and since it's stream of consciousness, that type of voice just brings you into the headspace of the characters in a very intimate way. So my experience was that when I was reading it in this way, about 2/3 of the way through the novel, the story that you've been reading, the narrative, it ends. And then the next part is called Time Passes. And you find out pretty quickly when you read Time Passes that the main character, Mrs. Ramsay, whose consciousness you have been inhabiting for the first 2/3 of the book, she's dead. It's announced pretty matter-of-factly that Mrs. Ramsay she's gone. So now we're in somebody else's head. I forget whose head it was, but I again, because I was so immersed in it, it was devastating that this character I'd become so intimate with and fond of, and then whose body and mind I had inhabited was suddenly gone, and I was sort of left out in the cold. So I bring all that up just to say that you can have pretty intense experiences reading, not just watching, but reading, and using your own imagination and mental apparatus to create the movie in your own head. That's a pretty amazing experience, and it was for me with To the Lighthouse. So, okay. I guess I can say more personal stuff in terms of why The Hours, the novel, and the film are important to me. Well, I'll say the film that actually I've taught it quite a few times, and I've taught it in other classes. I teach it as an example of a revisionist melodrama in one of the classes that I teach. And the book is okay, so the film is important to me, and the book is important to me too, mostly because of the subject matter about AIDS. So most of you probably weren't around when it was at its height, or nadir, at its low point in terms of people who were infected and were dying, many of them gay, as in the film. So it was an important issue for me at the time. In fact, when I read The Hours first, I was actually writing a novel about AIDS, and I wrote a trilogy of plays about AIDS too. And most of it was mostly based on personal experience, because in the early 90s, I was a home health aide working with men living and dying, living with and dying of AIDS. And in the early 90s, it was a death sentence when you got an HIV diagnosis. It's it means you weren't going to go quite yet, but AIDS itself, not HIV, but AIDS itself was just around the corner. And once that came, you had 1 or 2 years to live. This was before all of the drug cocktails and what have you were devised to make AIDS a manageable disease. Back then, it was quite unmanageable and it was quite devastating, and I got to see a lot of that myself firsthand. So that's why I appreciate writers like Michael Cunningham, who were also on the front lines and were writing profound literary works about it. All right, I'm just going to say something really quickly about Cloud Atlas, another book. I don't have the copy of it. I gave it away. I'm not going to be too long on this, but maybe I should deal with it at another time. Yes, I will talk about Cloud Atlas another time.